Hey, so in this video, I'm going to be going over general characteristics of instruments. This is mostly going to apply to gongs. It will apply a little bit to bowls as well, but when it comes to gongs, there is so much variety in how they can sound, and it can feel a little overwhelming at first. However, there are some guidelines. Generally, small gongs will sound a certain way compared to big gongs. And gongs made out of like this material is generally going to sound a little bit different than gongs made out of that material, so on and so forth. So I want to sort of go over the general physical characteristics of gongs so that you know sort of like what sound you're going to end up with based off of what a gong looks like. This is going to make it a lot easier for when you purchase your gong. I would highly recommend, if you have access to going somewhere in person. I know, for example, the Gong Shop, they have a showroom in LA and San Francisco. If you live in either of those locations, I would 1,000,000% recommend going to the showroom. They have over 75 gongs set up in their store, and you can just try them out, and you can sign up for like a consultation or a session where you just explore, and you can listen and you can feel the vibrations and you can experience so many different types of gongs. But not all of us have access to a place like that. So I want to give you just some general guidelines of how gongs are going to sound based off of how they look. And from there, you can kind of decide what sort of sounds you like. So let's get into this. So really the four main things I'm going to talk about are the size or the diameter of the gong, the material, the thickness or the weight, and the edges. And then the things that sound different about gongs usually have to do with the pitch. So higher pitch is going to be a faster vibration, a higher vibration. It's going to be up high rather than down low. A bigger gong, we'll get into this, big versus small. How responsive the gong is. So what I mean by how responsive it is, it means how much do I need to dig in? How much force or pressure do I need to use with my mallet in order to get the whole gong to sound and to start vibrating and to activate? So if something is very responsive, it means that I can just touch it very gently and the sound will blossom very easily. If something is less responsive, that means that I'm going to have to use a little bit more force and more energy in order to get the gong to fully sound. We'll talk a little bit about tone, brighter versus darker, and this has to do with the overtones. So if you haven't already watched the video on fundamental versus overtones, I would check that out. And then we'll talk a little bit about attack versus spread. And what that means is sort of like going along with this. When I tap the instrument, how much do I hear the contact that the mallet makes with the gong? And how much do I hear all the resonance afterwards? So hoping that all makes sense. Let's dive into this a little bit. This is really just an introduction to these topics, so I'm not going to go super deep into everything, into the science behind it or why it is like this. I do think just generally it's really good to understand these four concepts when you're looking at gongs. Okay, so the size. This is just the diameter. If I were to take a measuring tape to my gong, how big is it? How big or small is it by measurement? There's basically no limit for gongs. There are gongs that can be as small as 3 or 4 inches. That's just going to be like a tiny little thing like that. And maybe you've seen people have those little things that they put on their desk. That's a gong. It doesn't have to be big in order for it to be a gong. I would call it a teeny tiny gong though. And then there are some huge Mondo gongs that are like 60 inches or even more than that. Actually, I have a really old picture of me in grad school next to, I think it was a 60-inch gong. I'll have to dig that up and find that. The most common range, though, for gongs is between 25 inches to 35 inches, and the standard size for like sound healing is 32 inches, 30 or 32 inches. So that when you're looking at that, that's going to look like a gong to you. Around 30, 32 inches, when you see that out in the wild, you're going to recognize that as a gong. And then things that are below 25 inches, it's going to look more like a cymbal, like what you play on a drum set. And then once you get above 35 inches, that's when they start to get really quite big. Actually, my gongs here, I have a 36 inch and a 38 inch. This one is quite big. And it's difficult for me to move, actually, because it's so big. So this is another thing to keep in mind. How much are you going to be moving this? How do you want to be... if you want to be carrying around a gong, if you want to hold it in one hand and then play with the other hand and walk around so that, you know, everyone listening to your session gets some close-up time with the gong, you might want to go for something smaller, like 25 inches or smaller. It depends on the thickness and the weight, how heavy it's going to be. But just to think about this, I can barely even lift this thing by myself and carry it because it's just really big. So just something to think about. Is this something that you are going to be moving around a lot? Do you hold sessions mostly out of your home or out of like a studio where the instruments live all the time? Or are you going to be packing up and moving it all the time? If you're going to be packing up and moving it all the time, I wouldn't recommend going higher than 35 inches for your gong. So, again, I like to bring up these topics. Like, it might seem like, okay, why is she getting so deep into this and like sciencey? It's really like for the practicality of it. Yes, we want to know what we like, but also just what's going to work for our lifestyle and for our business and for our practice. So, okay, size. The next thing with this is, generally speaking, the bigger the instrument, the lower the pitch. And so I've already sung for you. I'm not claiming to be a good singer, but the higher the higher the pitch, it's like a high versus low. And so if you like a high pitch, if you like high sounds, you're going to want to go for a smaller gong. If you like really low and deep sounds, then you might want to go for a bigger gong. That's not the only factor, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the other factors as well. But if you're looking at two gongs, let's say you're looking at a Paiste symphonic gong that's like one of the most standard gongs used in sound healing. Let's say you're looking at a 28-inch Paiste symphonic gong, and you're looking at a 34-inch Paiste symphonic gong. They're exactly the same, but one's small and one's big. This one is going to be higher pitched and this one's going to be lower. A lot of the other qualities of the sound are going to sound pretty similar, but it's going to be high in pitch versus low in pitch. Also, if you can't really imagine in your mind how these sound different, check out the video that is online shopping with me. I'm going to be clicking on like sound clips and taking you through what everything sounds like, and just going over everything that I'm talking about here alongside some sound clips in real time, like on actual sound healing websites. Okay. The thing with bigger instruments also is that they produce bigger sound waves. So generally speaking, the bigger the gong, the more somatic the experience, meaning we're going to feel the sound waves more than with a smaller instrument. Generally, I mean, maybe you've experienced this if you've gone to like a show before where there's speakers. You can hear like deep bass. You can feel it in your body. You feel it in your gut. And I like to talk about like the chakra system in my courses. And generally speaking, lower pitches do correspond to the lower chakras. Lower pitches, we feel it more in our third chakra and our solar plexus, in our gut and below. And then generally these higher pitches, we feel more in our heart and above. So again, not everyone is experiencing them the exact same way, but generally we're going to feel lower pitches more in the body, and higher pitches are going to be more experienced up higher. So also, bigger instruments can get a bigger and a deeper and a fuller sound. Not necessarily louder, but it fills a space more. So something to think about, if you play in a yoga studio that has a huge space, like it can fit, I don't know, 100 people in it, or if you're playing some type of corporate event, or if you're playing like at a convention center, or in a space that's just really large, you'll probably want to have a large instrument to match the space. It's going to fill the space much more. As opposed to a smaller instrument, there's going to be a limit to how far that sound can extend. High-pitched instruments can also be loud, but it has a more piercing type of quality to it. So there's an energetic difference between high and low pitches, sort of what I already talked about. We're going to hear low things deeper, lower in the body, and higher pitched things have a more sort of like pointy and direct and focused sound to them. Again, I'll get more into this in the online shopping just so you can hear more of what I'm talking about. Okay, the response. This is how fast or slow the instrument creates sound. So like when you tap the gong, how long does it take for the gong to fully speak or blossom? So just like if you've watched any of my singing bowl stuff, I talk about like activating the bowl. In order to activate the bowl and get it to fully vibrating or singing, it takes a little bit. There's some bowls have a quick response time and other bowls have a slower response time. Sometimes the response has to do with how big it is. So usually bigger instruments have a slower response time. It takes a little bit longer to get them going because there's more material there. So in order to get everything vibrating, we need to spend a little bit more time or a little bit more energy. But once they get going, they stay for longer. They have a longer sustain. It's sort of like this concept, an object in motion stays in motion. If you have a really big instrument, it's going to take a little bit longer for you to get it going, but once it's going, it stays going for longer. Whereas if you have an instrument that has a quicker response time, it might sound very easily. It might activate very easily, and you can get it to sound just by touching it very gently, and it starts vibrating and ringing. But then that sound is also going to die out faster. So why do we care about this? First of all, how much energy do you want to be putting into your gong? Do you want the feel of your gong to feel really gentle and easy? Or do you want to put more body into it? Again, we want to think about the space that we're going to be playing in. If you're playing in a really small space, you might want something with a quicker response time, just because we don't need the ring to last forever in a small space. If we're playing in a bigger space, you might want to have something that just creates a bigger sound. So having a slower response time is going to be okay because it's ultimately going to create a longer sustain and ring for longer. Okay, so that's response. And I always like to just give the cliff notes for everything. So with size, basically bigger is going to be lower, smaller is going to be higher. Bigger, lower, smaller, higher. And then response has to do with how easily the gong vibrates. So a fast response is going to be like a very gentle touch and it just blossoms. And a slow response time is going to be that you need to dig in a little bit more, but then it rings for a longer time. And there's a couple of things that control the response time. One of them is how big it is. So if it's a bigger instrument, there's going to be a slower response time. Smaller instruments, there's a faster response time. Another thing that controls the response is the thickness or the weight. So this is really just how thin or thick the instrument is and how heavy it is. This is something that is counterintuitive, is that usually a thicker instrument has higher pitches. So I just want to demonstrate with my my chow gong and my wind gong. There's only 2 inches difference in diameter between these 2 gongs. Not a big difference at all, but there's a huge difference. This one is way more high pitched than this one. So let me just play them for you. And if you watch the fundamental, da, that's like the main pitch that I'm hearing from this. Da. And then my wind gong, again, it's only 2 inches bigger. It's not that much bigger. It is so much lower, so much lower. So the reason for this is that this is a much thicker instrument. It's a much thicker instrument, and this is much thinner. So usually the thinner instrument, it's a lower pitch, it has a faster response, and it has a more blended sound. I'll talk about that more. The thicker instrument, since there's extra mass, there's literally more material in it, it takes a little bit more energy. I had to tap it, like I had to play it 2 times to really get the full sound out of it. But it sustains for longer, it gets bigger and fuller. There's a wider spectrum of sounds. It has more high pitches. So again, with the, I'm gonna get into, do I get into color in this? No, I don't. Okay, so let me finish this and I'll talk about color or tone. The thinner instrument speaks more easily, it blossoms more quickly, the sound decays more quickly, and the sound is lighter or thinner. So let me just play these one more time. So what's happening here is there's a higher pitch, but there's also a spectrum of other sounds happening, and that happens because the instrument is thick. I do have to kind of dig in and really make sure I'm making full contact with the gong in order to get the full sound out of it. And then the sustain lasts for a while. It's still going. I don't know if it's going to be audible to you on the microphones, but yeah, generally it's like I have to play it a little bit harder. There's more highs in here. And then let me just play this. So I'm using a much more gentle touch on that. And you could hear it blossomed a lot faster. And this one does sustain for a long time. It is quite a big instrument, but let's see, it's dying down and it is still going. Generally though, the amount of audibility from a thinner instrument, it's gonna die down much faster. And then we can hear this, like the high pitches and the low pitches. And we can really think about this as tone color also. So this is a brighter sound. It has more high pitches, and this is a lower sound or a more blended sound. So just things to think about. These are like general characteristics with overtones. If we have something with higher overtones, that's going to sound a little bit brighter. And if we have something that brings out more low overtones, then it's going to sound darker. So yeah, thickness and weight. The thicker the instrument, the more highs we're going to get. And the thinner the instrument, the more lows we're going to get. So this is where it gets confusing though, is because you can have a small instrument that's also thin. And so the smallness of it might make it high pitched, but the thinness of it will make it lower in color. So again, I'm going to talk about this more in the online shopping video, so you can actually hear what I'm talking about a little bit more. I'm just trying to describe everything now so that you kind of get the basic understanding of like how this works. Just Cliff Notes version of this is that the thickness or the weight matters in terms of the response time and also the tone color. So the thicker the instrument, the more bright, the higher the overtones are going to be. And the thinner the instrument, the more dark or lower overtones we're going to get. Also, the more thick the instrument is, the slower the response time, but the longer the sustain. And then the thinner the instrument, the faster the response time and the shorter the sustain will be. So I know, like, you know, as I'm saying this, it's hard to keep track of everything, but that's why I'm doing a separate video on with the sound clips also. Okay. Edges, this is a very subtle thing, but check around the circumference of your bowls and your gongs and your bowls too. When you have thin edges, like the wind gong has thin edges versus the chow gong has thick edges. Thin edges mean that it's going to be more responsive, it's going to be more expansive to the sound, and it spreads out more easily. So thin edges mean a faster response time. The thick edges, there's actually a lip around this gong where it curls back, and then there's about an inch like around the circumference of the gong where it like turns back. And this is very subtle, but it kind of creates a more contained sound where the sound, like the gong is turned back, and so it kind of sends the sound in that focused direction. So generally, the thin edges are going to kind of bring the sound out more on the edges, and then the rim around it is going to make the sound a little bit more focused and create more of that bright tone. Thin edges also just make the instrument a little bit more delicate. So it's very important to observe proper playing technique when you have thinner instruments. With a thinner instrument, there's more likelihood that it could crack or break if you're like really digging in. It doesn't happen easily, but it does happen. Okay, and then I just quickly want to talk about material. It's not super, like this is not super important that you know like the quality of every metal, but I'm just kind of using this to show you. So basically how hard a material is going to play into all of these things, into how responsive the instrument is, into how heavy the instrument is, as to how thick the instrument is going to be. So most gongs are made out of bronze, which is an alloy or a mixture of copper and tin. And sometimes people use other metals like aluminum or zinc or other things. That's with bowls. Gongs tend to be bronze, sometimes gold, silver, and I've seen titanium used in artisanal gongs. So what I did here was just pull up the hardnesses of metals. I know this is kind of ridiculous, but basically, the harder the material on this scale, the brighter the sound. The softer the metal, the darker the sound. So bronze has a much warmer tone than steel even, and definitely compared to titanium. When you're using, if you've got a titanium gong, the titanium gongs, since they're very hard, they tend to make them very, very thin. So that makes them more responsive. So anyway, what I'm trying to just illustrate here is that there's a lot of different factors in how not only they sound, but also how they feel and the experience of playing them. So the material is also going to play into the tone color, whether it's bright or dark, and it's also going to play into the response time. So I know that this was kind of a lot, so I just want to like go over everything and just give like a quick summary. So basically, the general physical characteristics of the gong affect how it sounds. The size of the gong, the material, the thickness and the weight and the edges. These are all factors that will change and affect how an instrument sounds. And the way that it sounds different or the way that it feels different has to do with the pitch, how high or low the gong is, if something is more or less responsive, and that's going to really have to do with our experience of playing the instrument. If we're using more weight in our arms and our technique, or if it's more gentle. The tone color, brighter versus darker. What type of overtones are coming off of the instrument? Something can be low pitched but have high overtones. And then attack versus spread. How much are we hearing the attack? I didn't really talk about that. So that is going to be really with softer metals versus harder metals. If you have a softer metal gong, then you will hear more spread. You'll hear more of the resonance. If you have a harder material, you'll hear more of the contact being made from the mallet. And you might enjoy the sound of the mallet striking the gong. A lot of people really like to hear the ringing afterwards, so it's just something to keep in mind. If you really enjoy the ringing and the sustain, you might need to use a much softer mallet. We haven't even gotten into mallets. Okay. Just continuing on with this summary, with the size, bigger gongs are going to be lower in pitch, and they're also going to create bigger sound waves that we feel more in the body. Smaller gongs are going to be higher in pitch and have a more focused and direct and more pointy type of sound. Response time. How fast or slow does the instrument activate and fully vibrate? A slow response time means that we need to really dig in and use a little bit more force and energy into the gong. A fast response time means that we can be very gentle on the gong and it'll speak more easily. With the response, if it takes longer to get the gong to activate, then it's going to ring on its own naturally for longer. With a thinner gong, or with a gong that has a slower or with a faster response time means that the sound will activate quicker, but it's also going to decay quicker. Thickness and weight really plays into the response time. The thicker the instrument, the more we need to dig in. The thinner the instrument, the less we need to dig in. The thicker the instrument, the more high overtones that we're going to get and the more bright it's going to sound. The thinner the instrument, we're going to get more low overtones and it's going to sound darker. This, I think, is counterintuitive because we think thicker and, like, to me that seems like it would be lower, but it's actually going to be higher in pitch. Edges, I would really just pay attention. If you have thin edges, if you have a wind gong where it's tapered at the edges, then this is going to be a little bit more, it's a little bit more delicate and we need to make sure that we're playing really properly so that we don't damage the instrument in any way. And also, if the edges are turned back, there's a little bit more focus to sound, again, creating like a pointier sound. And then the material is also going to play a role in the response time and the color. And it's also going to play a role in the attack, how much we hear the attack versus the spread. So I'm hoping this wasn't like too in the weeds for you guys. If you want more on this, just watch the online shopping video because I'll be getting more into how we can hear these sounds, even in the sound clips from many of the retailers' websites out there. Okay, that's it for this. See you in the next one. Bye.